Hello. We began the course with a discussion of what we meant by war. How could we understand war as a social phenomenon? We then moved to war on the individual level. How do we explain what happens to these individuals? What do they go through? And how do we then account for them doing so? That is, given the horror of war, which I described, how do we get so many people, ordinary men, if you will, usually men, to do this over and over again? Now we're going to move up one level of aggregation. And rather than talking about the individuals, what we're going to do is talk about the war of armies. That is, war as more of an exercise between these collectives that I talked about. I've been talking again and again and again about how important organization and collective effort is for war. Now we're going to move to this level. And we're first going to talk about the progress of war. That is, how war has moved and changed over the last millennia. What can we understand, in a sense, about this process of war, looking at it historically, and trying to figure out how that history of war also parallels a broader history of the Western civilization. Again, we're largely focused on the West. So, the progress of war of the millennia best is characterized by increasing complexity. That is, that the operational tasks facing any kind of army have become ever more complex. This requires much greater organizational sophistication and much more elaborate forms of discipline. So what we're talking about is this machine, this complex machine of killing has become more sophisticated, requiring much more discipline and ultimately much more lethal. Now, each shift in the history of the progress of war has been accompanied by revolutionary changes in operations, in logistics, technology, and social support. These are, in a sense, what has been known, and that was largely in reference to events going on in the 1990s and 2000, the revolution in military affairs. And there have been several of these revolutions, and we're going to try to map these out. Essentially what we're talking about is a fairly linear, although there are exceptions, but a fairly linear progression away from the individual and towards the constraints and requirements of the group. That is, that we have replaced the characteristics that we associate with a successful warrior with the characteristics associated with the best possible war machine, the best possible war organization. Now, these military revolutions have revolutionized the type of soldiers used, the tactics used, the levels of destruction, and the kinds of state necessary to fight. And I want to argue again that we're going to be seeing these. You can see a parallel of a lot of the history of the last 2,000 or 3,000 years by looking at these various constructs. So first, let's talk about the structure of armies and how the structure of armies has evolved over these years. I'm going to borrow from John Lynn, a fantastic military historian, in his sort of large groups, which he talks about ancient armies, feudal armies, stipendiary and contract armies, state commission armies, and volunteer and technical armies. And let's just go through each one and look at the kind of characteristics. Again, we're talking about generalities here. We're talking about there's going to be lots of exceptions, but just to give you an idea of how this process of armies has changed. So let's first begin with an ancient army. And really, we have two models. It's either composed of what we might call slave soldiers, or there's the citizen soldiers model. Slave soldiers or slave armies are the products of empire. These are largely composed by a conscription, in a sense, of subjects or of slaves without the kinds of rights that we're going to be seeing later on. In a sense, this is not conscription. This is just absorbing large parts of the population and forcing them forward. A very different model is the citizen army. And of course, we see the highlight of that in classical Greece. And then we're going to see a version of that in the Roman Republic, where much closer to what we're going to see in the 19th and the 20th century, serving in the military is part of the price of citizenship. And serving in the military also allows one to become a citizen. It gives one the right to be a citizen. These kinds of militaries are usually associated with a single weapon, most often a lance. There is some use of archery. Depending on the setting, you will have cavalry or you will have infantry, but it's relatively simple maneuvers and a relatively unsophisticated manner of organizing these. Partly because they're slave armies, you cannot expect very much from individual soldiers. What you want to do is to create an atmosphere where those soldiers can just move forward and accomplish their task without asking a great deal of them. Now again, we're going to be talking about, later on, we're going to be giving a little bit more detail about these, but we can talk about the next shift, at least again in Western Europe, is the feudal army. Now, this is characterized by the provision of military service in exchange for something other than money payment. A couple things are important here. As we see with the collapse of the Roman Empire or the decline of the Roman Empire, the capacity, again, largely in the West, to organize these large armies, to create these kinds of massive forces declines. What you get is a disaggregation of authority. What you get is a provincialization of authority. And along with that, you get a different kind of army. You get an army where the military institution itself brings few resources to the battle. It serves mostly to provide leadership and a temporary cohesion. This is armies, if you will, as mafia families, where simply there's an exchange of obligations, there is an exchange of loyalties. The loyalties are personal, but again, temporary. It's a very primitive form of organization. The discipline is lax, and you are relying to a large extent on the individual characteristics of your warriors. You are not, in a sense, aggregating all these efforts into something that's much greater than the sum of its parts. You are essentially summing up all these parts. Now, the technologies that make this central, one of them being the horse. The horse, this is this period in Western history is the highlight of the cavalry, when because you are having individual warriors and you have relatively simple motions, the fact that a knight or a warrior is on a horse gives him much more power. This is the high time of the kind of horse riding aristocracy. To this, you add the new kind of technology of a castle. Castles are ways, again, they are an architectural expression of the kind of disaggregation and division of authority. No longer can you rely on a central state that is able to impose these kinds of controls and create these large armies. Now you have power that is dispersed and therefore requiring these kinds of isolated bastions where the kind of primitive technology that is available to the army is relatively useless against these kinds of fortification.